Yes, you read the title correctly. I am bringing in an 8-year-old cinema camera into my production and using it as my main video camera in 2025. So why am I using a camera in 2025 that was released in 2017? And might it be a good idea for you too?
We about to change the game. We out here taking names. Let our voices rise. Let them reach the sky. We about to change the game. We out here taking names. Let our voices rise. Let them reach the
So the camera that I am using as my main video workhorse camera is the Canon C200. And yes, that was released in the early part of 2017. So at this point, really getting close, or even depending on when you're watching it, past an 8-year-old camera. And there are much newer, even much newer cinema cameras in Canon's own cinema camera, the C lineup. So why is it that I chose now to go and get the C200? And honestly, a huge factor in this was because there are so many newer, updated cinema cameras in Canon cinema lineup, because that has driven the price of C200s down a lot. And for the first time, basically since this camera has been on the market, that used C200 prices go way down. And I got this one for under $2,000, and I'm seeing them regularly and even more often, being even from like used resellers, being under $2,000. And for what you get from the C200, under $2,000, if you are looking for a cinema camera to have full-size XLR inputs, and you need potentially the possibility for RAW, but that's not the main part of your workflow. You need something that can do 4K up to 60. Technically, there is 120 frames per second on this. We might talk about that in a second, but that's not something that I would, if that's something you need from this camera, probably look elsewhere. But for the quality that you get out of this camera for that price point, sub $2,000, for the right person, and I think that includes me, it is really hard to beat. And I will say, like, if you are just a spec hunter, like you're looking for the highest resolution and the highest frame rates and whatever else, obviously an 8-year-old camera is not the place that you're going to want to look for that, because it's not where you're going to find it. But what drove me to get this camera and bring this on, and I will also say I actually use this for like most of 2024, and it's going to continue being my main camera into 2025. So I feel confident with what it can do and what I'm able to do with the C200, and I honestly have been loving using this camera as my main camera. And that is because of, first of all, just the image sensor. That is something that you really can't put onto paper, and it gets overlooked a lot of time. It's in camera reviews and tech reviews. Like, you can put super high resolutions on paper in a camera. That does not mean that the image looks good. And the C200 is a camera where consistently the image just looks good. I really like the sensor, and I will say that is kind of a theme with Canon's. I mean, Canon makes great sensors in general, but their cinema camera lineup, the sensors are just nice. They make pretty images, and at the end of the day, like, that's a pretty important part of what you want from a camera. But when we talk about something like the C200, yes, we have that beautiful image that it can create, but it also brings a lot of workflow advantages into the mix as well. So if you are not used to shooting with a cinema camera or a larger cinema camera, because some of the smaller, what gets considered or called cinema cameras now, like the FX3, FX30, the R5C, those kind of things, they don't actually have XLR inputs built into them. Something like this, the C200, does have XLR and full-size XLR inputs, which even the C70 and C80 in Canon's current cinema lineup don't have full-size XLR ports. you can argue back and forth and have your own opinions on whether having mini XLR versus full-size XLR. Also, that's something that like the Blackmagic pocket cinema cameras don't have the full size, they have the mini XLRs. That can be a preference thing for sure, but it is super nice to have them on the C200, and the preamps on the C200 are pretty good. They're not amazing, and it depends on what you are recording as to whether these will be good enough or really fit what you need from preamps in your audio recorder. But for dialogue, so for instance, right now I have a mic just out of frame here. It's a pencil condenser mic. For something like this, where you are recording dialogue, the preamps tend to be great. As long as you're not like cranking the preamps past like 60% of their volume, they stay clean and they stay clear and they sound good. Now, if you are trying to record lower volume audio or potentially like really high volume audio, that's not something I've ever tried, like big loud sound effect type stuff. This probably is not going to work as well. It's certainly not going to work as well as a dedicated like high-end field recorder. For instance, when I am doing like really quiet sounds, or I just need a dedicated sound recording option, I do have the Zoom FX3, and that has 32-bit float. This obviously does not have 32-bit float built into it, so that's another thing that you have to consider. But if you're able to, mic your talent, and it's again just dialogue based, and you are able to like dial in the gain settings for that, these sound really, really good. And I've been super happy with the sound quality that I've been able to get from recording directly into the C200. And so for basically anything where it is dialogue that I'm filming, I do record directly into the C200 instead of into the FX3, even though the FX3 has 32-bit float and certainly has cleaner preamps, especially when you're needing more gain behind that. But with dialogue, I don't need more gain. The C200 still sounds really good, and it's not worth the extra effort and the extra like workflow hassle to use a separate recorder and then sync that up in post when it's something dialogue based. So for really I was going to say 99%, but really anything that is dialogue based that I'm recording to the C200, I'm going to go with the audio directly into the C200. Another advantage to the C200 in terms of workflow is that it has that modular design. That means that you can very easily rig it out to have a bunch of stuff on it. You have the handle, you can add monitors and wireless video, V-mount batteries, like whatever you need to mount on this, you can do that pretty easily. But then you can also strip it down really easily so that you can put it on a gimbal. Now, it is a heavy camera, so you're not going to probably put it on like my Weebill S from Zhiyun is not going to handle a camera this big and heavy very well. But something a little bit bigger probably could handle it without any issues, depending obviously on how big and how heavy the lens that you're using with it is. So you don't necessarily have to have the largest like crazy type of gimbal in order to make this work. So that modular design does make it very versatile. I will say for me, really, I don't use this or have ever any thought of using this camera on a gimbal. If I'm going to do gimbal work, I'm going to use my Weebill S3 and I'm going to put one of my mirrorless cameras on it. And part of that is also because if I'm doing something on a gimbal, I'm probably filming at slower motion, like maybe 120 frames per second. And like I said earlier, the 120 frames per second in this camera, the C200 is only at 1080. You don't have autofocus and it just doesn't look good. So in my brain, like one of the things is I don't really even consider the C200 to be a camera with 120 frame per second slow motion. Now, while we're talking about resolution and frame rates, this does shoot 4K up to 60 frames per second, and it can do 4K up to 60 frames per second in RAW. Now, I don't shoot RAW for my workflow very often, like at all. And I would also say this is like Canon's Cinema Raw Lite. It was one of the first times that internal RAW recording was available in even one of their cinema cameras below the C700 series, which the C700 series is a very cost prohibitive series of cinema camera. And it is definitely an early form of their RAW. It's not necessarily the easiest to work with, and the file sizes are just ridiculously huge. And so for me, it's like a really cool thing that it has that as an option if necessary, but isn't the reason that I got the C200. Now, I know that there are people who, 2017 and even for several years use the C200 with the C200's RAW files as the main part of their workflow. And there are certainly like several workarounds where people were filming the RAW and then converting that into like Apple's ProRes 422 10-bit containers and then keeping those files rather than the RAW files. And that's a possibility, but if you're really looking for something that's going to give you 422 10-bit, there are better options now. Again, the thing that drew me to the C200 is the image quality. And I don't need with this image, honestly, this might sound a little bit heretical to some of you, but I don't need the 10-bit footage because the 8-bit footage off of this just looks really good. And 90% of the projects that I've been doing in this past year of 2024 and into 2025 have been filmed in 8-bit, and nobody's complained about it. And a lot of times I've been like cutting that back and forth with 10-bit footage from my mirrorless cameras. And again, nobody's complained about it because the sensor just creates really beautiful images. And there are going to be limitations on 8-bit footage versus 10-bit footage and how much you can like color grade those images. But I will say, and one of the things that I would definitely suggest if you're using the C200 and filming in the C200 is that you make sure that you're filming the MXF files and not the MP4 files, because the amount of data and just room that you're able to color grade and push the colors is different, is noticeably different. Even like sharpness is different from the MP4 files. So definitely use that MXF file wrapper. But when you're doing that, again, it's plenty of room for me to get the colors that I want out of it, to get the footage looking the way that I want out of it, and to end up with footage that I enjoy and am happy to present to clients and happy to use in the content that I'm creating for myself personally, which, by the way, I am filming on the C200 right now. That's why I keep pointing at the... And any time that you are looking at any kind of camera purchase, I mean, one thing you could do is just get the newest camera and shell out whatever amount of money that's going to cost. And if you have the budget and ability to do that, cool. But if not, and I'm assuming that if you're looking at this video about an 8-year-old cinema camera in 2025, you're probably at least considering going somewhere in a more budget-friendly direction, then you really have to look at what does your workflow require and what are the ways that you can get that within the budget that you have and whatever budget constraints that might include. And, one of the things that I like about the C200 is I film a lot of stuff, certainly anything like this YouTube video, anything that's going on the internet, I film it in 1080. And then like in post, I export that as a 4K file if I'm going to upload to YouTube, and then YouTube sees it as a 4K file. And with compression and everything that we see on the YouTube platform, honestly, like this 1080 coming out of the C200, it looks just as good, if not better, than a lot of native 4K files that are, uploaded to YouTube just based on compression. And that's just because, again, the image sensor in this camera looks good, and the 1080 holds up in that situation. But you certainly have the option, and I do on some projects that require it, film in 4K, again, up to 60 frames per second. And I personally love shooting stuff at 60 frames per second to get just a little bit of that slow-mo, but not like the crazy slow motion of filming at 120 frames per second and slowing that down to 24 frames per second. For me, 120 frames is for like action or something, like everyday type of slow motion for I don't know, lack of a better term. 60 frames per second works way better. Again, like that's something where you have to look at your workflow. What do you require? Are you filming like action sequences and like, I don't know, cars, stuff that's moving quickly? Maybe in that case, you do need something that films 120 frames per second more frequently. And if that's the case, then you might want to look at something other than this camera. But for me and filming the type of stuff that I do, 60 frames per second is what I'm going to use anyway. So having a nice 60 frame per second option at up to 4K in this camera is exactly what I need and exactly what I want. Now, when we're talking about getting this camera in 2025, I'm definitely talking about getting it off of the used market. And there were, especially particularly in the US, a couple different variations of how you could get the C200, and one is with the viewfinder, and then you had like the monitor and handle, grip, everything that came with it. And that's what I have, except I actually have an aftermarket plate and then handle on top of it rather than the one that came with it. But it does have the monitor, and the monitor, while it has its issues, is super convenient, and it makes it a really small, for being a cinema camera, all-in-one package where I have a built-in monitor. Like right now, I can look at myself and see, my audio levels. I can see what my exposure looks like. I have all the exposure tools that you would expect from a cinema camera. I can just look and see what my frame is looking like right here, all built into this one camera. So I don't have to have extra monitors set up or anything like that. Again, I'm running XLR audio directly into the camera. So it is a really convenient platform for the way that I work, because 90% of the time I am filming by myself. I am, for lack of a better term, director photography. And then in this situation where I'm making YouTube videos, I'm on camera as well. So having an all-in-one package where everything is really simple, really easy to use, really easy to set up and then hit record and go is super valuable to me and to my workflow. Now, another thing we have to take into consideration when we're talking about cameras from 8 years ago, as this one is that technology moves along, and 8 years in terms of tech is a long time. And the autofocus capabilities of the C200 at the time, like, people were just mind blown at how good it was. Now it's relatively middle of the pack, maybe a little bit behind that. But one option that makes me super happy and comfortable using the autofocus all the time is that it has the ability to set face only autofocus. So that means when it detects a face, it will focus on that. And if it loses the face, instead of hunting or trying to find something else, it just stays where it was the last time it found that face. So in a situation like this, in like a sit-down interview, anytime that it's like a talking head or the main focus is a person in the frame, it's something that I can rely on and feel really comfortable, even like now where I'm not behind the camera, I'm not like even close enough to change focus if I need to, or really even see that the camera might be drifting or something. I feel confident in just setting it and letting it go and using autofocus for that, because again, if it loses my face, it's just going to stay where it was, and it's just going to stay there until it picks it up again. And so in a situation like this where I'm not shifting, plane of focus all that much, if it loses me for a little while, it's not that big a deal, and you're probably not even going to notice whether it has lost me or not. So it makes it still useful even compared to some cameras today in terms of tracking face. Now, it does not have eye detect autofocus, so that has advantages, eye detect certainly, but I don't think that for most situations it's going to make or break how well the autofocus is doing. Like, it's going to get close enough to the eye in most situations that you're not going to feel like you're losing out because it's face detect and not eye detect. But it is something to be aware of. There is no eye detect in this. And there is like object tracking autofocus in the C200. However, the modern Canon cameras are very easy to use. You like tap on an object in the frame and it just follows it around and stays on there. This, it takes a couple steps in order to choose an object and track it. And I feel like most of the time when you're trying to track an object, you have to move faster than that. And if you're not moving faster than that, you can probably, like, if you need to take time to set up the object tracking, you could probably just manual focus with that object. So for me, the object tracking is not something that I use at all. And if object tracking is something that is like a big part of your workflow, again, this is probably not the best camera for that. There are other autofocusing modes that work really well. Usually when I am filming objects, I'm going to be using the autofocus area select box. And that works really well. It's Canon's dual pixel autofocus. It is not, again, the newest dual pixel autofocus version 2, which is significantly better than dual pixel autofocus, but dual pixel autofocus is what, like the original version of dual pixel autofocus is what I've been using on a lot of cameras for a long time. So I know how to work with that, and it still works really well, just not as well as the version 2 cameras. And you do have to pay attention a little bit more. You have to maybe put a little bit more thought into when you're using autofocus and how you're using autofocus. But for me, I can confidently get great results with the autofocus options that are in this camera for what I need to do. And so I've talked about some of the downsides as I've gone through what I like about the camera. One of the things that could be a downside or an upside for non-RAW recording, you have to use the SD card slots. And there are 2 SD card slots. You can relay record into both at the same time, but you have to use SD card slots if you're not filming RAW. And if you are filming RAW, you have to use CFast cards, which is another, like, at this point, almost antiquated type of memory card. And the good thing with that is, like, they are not as in demand, so the price of them has come down, especially if you're buying them used. You have to be wary about buying used memory cards because, you know, who knows how well they treated them before they got to you. CFast has never been my favorite form of memory storage. It certainly works, but again, I'm not filming RAW very often at all, so it's not a big deal to me. And the other side of that equation is that a lot of people, especially when you're shooting like with a cinema camera, a lot of people don't like only having SD cards, which anything that isn't RAW, again, is going to be going only to those SD cards. For me, I'm the exact opposite. I like having SD cards as my main storage medium because that's what I have on my mirrorless cameras. That's what I have on my B camera, which is the C100, the original C100. And so it makes the workflow just really simple. I've never had issues with SD cards. I know that issues happen with SD cards. You have to be careful and be aware of how you're using them. Format them before you start recording something. They can break, so be careful with them. Have SD card like holders to protect your cards. But SD cards is the workflow that I've always used. It's what I'm comfortable with, and it's what I like because it just is how my workflow goes. So if I were to bring in another medium, I would have to add steps and change things around in my workflow. So I prefer staying SD card only. So for me, that is a positive. For a lot of people, that will be a negative. A huge complaint that I kind of talked about earlier, but was always a complaint with the C200, is that there is no option to film just 10-bit 422 footage. You have the 8-bit if you're filming to the SD cards, or you have the RAW, which is 12 or 14-bit, depending on what frame rates you're filming at, on the CFast cards. And there was no like that medium in between, which I think like a lot of people have realized, like, hey, 10-bit 422 is a great format to be filming in. It gives you a lot of flexibility, but you don't have like too much data that you're storing that you don't really need. So 10-bit tends to be a good sweet spot for a lot of people. And I can sympathize with that. I like the 10-bit coming off of like my mirrorless cameras, for instance. I do like a 10-bit image. But as I said, 10-bit was never an option in the C200. There's no way to like even send out a 10-bit signal to an external recorder. That was something that people complained about and asked for and never got on the C200. So if like having a 10-bit workflow is necessary for you, again, this is not that camera. So again, anytime you're making a camera or a gear purchase, you have to weigh out what are the pros and cons and how is it going to fit in. Is it going to fit into your workflow? Does it get what you need at the budget that you are looking at? And for me, very much this does. I have loved having the C200 and having that be part of my workflow and my production. I would say, like, if you're in a situation where you're making a lot of this is an awesome YouTube camera. If you're just doing YouTube content, it's probably overkill for that. But if you are looking for something to really have fun with and have nice, really high quality content for YouTube, and I would say probably also doing a lot of work where you're delivering videos and content for things that are going online, whether it is to YouTube or like clients that are needing social media platform files. Now, caveat there in that this is not going to be the easiest camera for like filming vertically. There's no like mounts to mount it vertically like something like the C70 or C80 would have built into the camera. But if you're filming horizontally and delivering to some kind of web-based platform, 10-bit probably not necessary, RAW certainly not necessary, and this fits right into that category where it looks great, the files are not like overly bloated, and it fits that workflow, I think, really, really well. So if that's something that you do a lot, I really like the Canon C200 for that workflow. But if you're doing stuff where you need RAW, I mean, again, it offers it, but those files are huge. If you're doing stuff where you specifically need a 10-bit workflow, that's just not going to be a good camera for that. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. Maybe this made you think about getting a C200, or maybe reevaluate what you're looking at in terms of your camera gear. If you did like the video, give it a thumbs up. In the comments below, let me know what you think about the C200. What are you shooting on right now, and what are you maybe looking to get into to use in 2025? If you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button. Thanks. See ya.
We about to change the game. We out here taking